Hey, come in, get low, get comfortable, let your eyes go soft if they want to. Tonight isn't about the land of Ooh itself, not the kingdoms, not the lore, not the 1,000 years of grief buried in under the candy. Tonight we're going somewhere most fans never bother to look, which is backward, off the screen entirely, into the rooms where Adventure Time was actually made. Because there is a version of this show that exists only in production binders and old interviews and voice actor commentary tracks, a version made of choices and accidents and real human beings sitting in a booth together saying lines into a microphone, and almost none of that version ever gets talked about the way the lore does. So that's where we're headed, 150 facts about the making of the thing, not the thing itself. Let's start close to where it all began, in a cramped room with a ukulele. The Adventure Time theme song runs exactly 30 seconds, and Pendleton Ward performed it himself, recorded so simply and so close to the microphone that you can hear the faint sound of someone typing on a keyboard somewhere in the background of the take. That typing was never removed. Ward liked the sound of the room as it was, imperfections included, and so the accidental noise of somebody's fingers on a keyboard became a permanent, tiny fingerprint on every single episode of the show, more than 280 of them, stretching out across 8 years of broadcast. That's fact one, and it tells you almost everything about the spirit the rest of these facts are going to reveal. This was a show built, again and again, on the decision to keep the accident rather than clean it up. Before Adventure Time was a series, it was a 7-minute short film, and that short was Pendleton Ward's pitch. He didn't walk into the meeting at Frederator Studios with only storyboards. He brought his guitar and by some accounts sang the theme song live, acoustically, in the room, to executives who were deciding whether this thing deserved to exist. That short aired as a standalone episode on Nicktoons Network on January 11th, 2007, and aired again inside Frederator's anthology series, Random Cartoons, in December of 2008. It found its way online afterward and spread the way things spread before anyone had a word as tidy as viral for it yet, reaching an audience far larger than a 7-minute short usually reaches. Nickelodeon had first right of refusal on turning it into a series. They passed. According to accounts of the show's history, Frederator pitched the full series to Nicktoons Network multiple times, and it was turned down repeatedly before the option became available elsewhere. Cartoon Network picked it up instead, and that single decision, made by executives who could easily have made the opposite call, is the reason any of these facts exist to be told at all. Drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from tonight and what time it is there. I like knowing that. I like knowing there are people scattered across a dozen time zones, all lying still in the dark at the same moment, listening to the same story about a cartoon that turned out to be about a lot more than it looked like from the outside. Before it was called Adventure Time, and before Jeremy Shada ever voiced Finn, the character was named Penn in that original pilot short, and he was voiced not by Jeremy, but by his older brother, Zach Shada. When the series was picked up for real, Zach had aged past the point where he could plausibly voice a young boy, so his younger brother auditioned instead. Here's a detail that still catches people off guard when they hear it for the first time. The show's producers did not initially realize that Jeremy and Zach were brothers. Jeremy has said in interviews that the team simply thought they'd gotten lucky finding someone who happened to sound like the kid from the original short. They had, but not for the reason they assumed. Jeremy Shada was 12 years old when he was cast, and here's where the show made one of its quietest and most unusual production decisions. Partway through the series, as Jeremy moved through his early teenage years, his voice began to change the way any boy's voice changes during puberty, cracking, deepening, losing the higher register it had when recording began. A different show, especially a different children's show, might have recast the role to preserve consistency. Pendleton Ward chose not to. Instead, the show let Finn age in step with the actor playing him, moving from 12 years old at the start of the series to somewhere in his late teens by the finale, and the storytelling itself matured alongside that vocal change, becoming heavier, stranger, and more emotionally complicated as the years went on. Finn's voice getting deeper wasn't hidden or edited around. It became part of the character's actual growth. That is a genuinely rare choice in children's animation, where continuity of voice is usually treated as sacred, and it's one of the clearest pieces of evidence that this show trusted reality over convenience whenever the two came into conflict. Jake the dog was voiced by John DiMaggio, who many viewers already knew, whether they realized it or not, as the voice of Bender on Futurama. DiMaggio's rough, gravel-bottomed voice is instantly recognizable once you've heard it named, and it's a strange kind of magic that the same voice that gave us a hedonistic robot could also give us one of the warmest, most emotionally generous characters in modern animation. Tom Kenny voiced the Ice King, and if that name means nothing to you by itself, here's the fact that usually makes people sit up. Tom Kenny is also the voice of SpongeBob SquarePants, the same performer who gives us an eternally cheerful sea sponge also gave us a 1,000-year-old man slowly losing his mind and his memory to a cursed crown, delivered with enough specificity that the character never once feels like a repeat performance of anything else in Kenny's career. Hendon Walsh voiced Princess Bubblegum, bringing a controlled, precise warmth to a character who is simultaneously a scientist, a monarch, and someone quietly buckling under the weight of everything she's built. Nikki Yang voiced both Lady Rainicorn and BMO, and in an unusual overlap of craft and biography, Yang has described BMO as a male character in her own understanding of the role, even though the show's text never settles the question, and different characters use different pronouns for BMO throughout the run. That ambiguity was a specific choice rather than an oversight, and it's one of the places where the show's instinct for openness shows up in something as small as a pronoun. Here's a piece of casting trivia that sits at the emotional center of one of the show's most devastating relationships. Marceline the Vampire Queen was voiced by Olivia Olson. Her father, Hunson Abadir, ruler of the Nightosphere, and Marceline's absent, complicated demon father in the show, was voiced by Martin Olson. Martin Olson is Olivia's real, actual father. A father voicing the father of the character his own daughter voices, is the kind of detail that sounds almost too tidy to be true, but it's documented, and it means every scene between Marceline and Hunson carried a small unspoken layer of real biography running underneath the performance. Martin Olson didn't stop there either. He wrote the official Adventure Time Encyclopedia, a companion book to the series, and later collaborated with Olivia herself on a second book that dug further into Marceline's history. The boundary between the show's fictional world and the real lives of the people making it was unusually soft in this production, and that softness shows up again and again once you start looking for it. There's another set of sibling castings worth knowing. Isabella Akers and Ava Akers are real life sisters, and they voice the younger versions of Princess Bubblegum and Marceline, respectively, in flashback material. Tom Kenny's real wife, Jill Talley, voices Maja the Sky Witch, a recurring character in the show's later seasons. None of this casting overlap changes the plot of a single episode, but it tells you something true about the culture of the production. This was a workplace where relationships outside the booth kept finding their way into the booth over and over, almost as if the show wanted its real-world connections mirrored somewhere inside Ooh. Now, something about how the actual recording sessions worked, because it's genuinely unusual for a show of this scale. Adventure Time recorded its voice cast together in group sessions rather than isolating each actor separately the way most animated productions do for scheduling efficiency. Jeremy Shada has talked about this in interviews, describing how he, John DiMaggio, Hynden Walsh, and Tom Kenny would typically be in the booth together for a given episode's dialogue, playing off each other's timing and energy the way you would in a live performance, rather than trading isolated line readings back and forth through a sound engineer. The only time this ensemble approach broke down was when an actor had a scheduling conflict or lived somewhere that made in-person recording impossible, in which case they'd patch in remotely. Guest directors, when the show brought them in for a particular episode's specific visual style, would often sit in on these ensemble recordings too, shaping the performance in real time, rather than reviewing it after the fact. Speaking of guest directors, here's a fact that surprises a lot of casual viewers. The acclaimed Japanese director, Masaaki Yuasa, came in to direct an anime-styled episode of the show, working through a translator during the voice recording process. That kind of cross-cultural, creative collaboration folded quietly into a single 11-minute episode of what was still technically a children's cartoon is the kind of thing that never made headlines at the time, but says a great deal about how far Adventure Time's creative ambitions reached beyond its own borders. The animation itself deserves its own long stretch of facts, because almost nobody watching casually ever stops to think about how the show actually got made, frame by frame. Adventure Time was produced using hand-drawn animation, built around a workflow where storyboard artists were given roughly a week to thumbnail, meaning to rough out a storyboard, filling in the action, the dialogue, and the jokes themselves before the showrunner and creative directors reviewed it and sent back notes. This matters more than it might sound like, because it means the people drawing the show were also, in a very real sense, writing large parts of it as they drew, working from loose outlines rather than fully scripted teleplays. Each episode took roughly 8 to 9 months to complete from start to finish, which meant that at any given moment, the crew had multiple episodes moving through different stages of production simultaneously, a kind of overlapping assembly line of imagination. The actual animation work, once storyboards were locked, was produced overseas, primarily by Rough Draft Korea Kone, Luted, and Seirom Animation in Seoul, South Korea, both studios that had experience with American animated television and that handled the frame-by-frame execution of what the Los Angeles-based creative team had designed. The drawings were done by hand on paper in the traditional sense, and then scanned, digitally composited, and painted using digital ink and paint tools, most commonly associated with the software Toon Boom Harmony, which became the standard pipeline tool for the show as production matured. This is worth sitting with for a second. The wobbly, hand-drawn look of Adventure Time, the slightly loose lines that never feel like they were generated by a computer, is not an aesthetic effect layered on top of digital animation. It's the residual evidence of the fact that human hands were physically drawing these characters on paper, season after season, before any of it touched a screen. Each individual episode of the show runs about 11 minutes, and pairs of episodes were frequently broadcast together to fill a standard half-hour programming slot, which is part of why so many fans remember watching 2 Adventure Times back-to-back rather than a single episode alone. Season 1 ran from April 5th, 2010 through September 27th, 2010, and after the premiere drew strong ratings, landing in the #1 spot in multiple kids' demographic categories. Cartoon Network renewed the show for a second season and kept renewing it for years afterward, eventually stretching to 10 full seasons and an assortment of specials, movies, and spin-offs. The show's original title sequence went through more revision than most viewers ever suspect. An early concept for the opening was reportedly rejected for being too crazy and nonsensical, even by the standards of a show that would go on to feature businessmen frozen in icebergs and a penguin who turns out to be an ancient cosmic entity, and the eventual sequence that made it to air drew visual inspiration from sources like The Simpsons and Pee-wee's Playhouse, aiming for something more graphically clean and recognizable than the initial pitch had been. If you look closely at that title sequence across the years, small details shift. In the finale era version, for instance, characters named Shermie and Beth appear writing a future version of Sweet Pea, and Beth is revealed by an on-screen title card to be Beth the Pup Princess, a tiny piece of world building smuggled into a 15-second stretch of animation that most viewers never paused to read. Here's a detail about a hidden message that very few casual viewers ever catch, because catching it requires literally reversing the audio. In the episode Heat Signature, the ghostly chanting heard in the background contains a backmasked message, meaning it was recorded, reversed, and layered into the audio so that only playing the sound backward reveals actual words. When reversed, the ghosts can be heard saying something to the effect of farewell to a specific member of the crew, wishing him luck in New York and hoping he'd come back soon. It was a private message from the crew to a departing colleague, hidden inside a broadcast children's cartoon in a form that only the most dedicated, technically inclined fans would ever uncover. That's not a plot device. That's just two people who work together, finding an odd, loving way to say goodbye through the show itself. Now, a fact about names that reveals just how much personal history the writers folded into background details without ever making a fuss about it. The Ice King's fiancée, back when he was still fully human and known as Simon Petrikov, was named Betty. In the show's earliest network pitch materials, before any of the mythology around Betty had been developed, Betty was actually the working first name originally intended for Princess Bubblegum herself. The writers essentially recycled a discarded piece of early development and repurposed it years later into one of the show's most quietly devastating pieces of backstory. Nothing in early Adventure Time gets thrown away completely. It just waits, sometimes for years, for a use worthy of it. Let's talk about the guest voice cast, because this is where Adventure Time quietly assembled one of the strangest and most impressive rosters in modern animated television, often without ever making a big publicity event out of it. George Tucky voiced Ricardio the Heart Guy, a character whose entire identity twist, revealed across two appearances, hinges on the fact that he is secretly the extracted heart of the Ice King himself. Mark Hamill voiced multiple roles, including the Fear Feaster and the Dark Magician, bringing the same voice that generations know as Luke Skywalker and that another generation associates with his celebrated performance as the Joker in Batman, the animated series, into a candy-colored post-apocalyptic cartoon. Justin Roiland, later known for co-creating Rick and Morty, voiced the shrill, unstable Earl of Lemongrab. Weird Al Yankovic voiced the Banana Man, and a character named Representative Sybil. Neil Patrick Harris was the first voice of Prince Gumball, the Fiona and Cake universe counterpart to Princess Bubblegum, and there's a neat layers to that casting worth knowing. Harris is gay in real life, and in the eventual Fiona and Cake spin-off series, Prince Gumball's counterpart is shown in a relationship with Marshall Lee, the gender-swapped counterpart to Marceline. Donald Glover voiced Marshall Lee himself. Andy Samberg voiced Party Pat and Rat Bear. Ron Perlman voiced the Lich, bringing a gravelly, ancient weight to the character that the writers had originally envisioned coming from a different performer entirely. According to production trivia, Tom Waits was Pendleton Ward's original choice to voice the Lich, and while that casting never happened, the team ultimately landed on Ron Perlman, another actor known for a similarly weathered, distinctive voice, which suggests the sound the writers were chasing for that character was very specific even before they found the right person to deliver it. Kristen Schaal, Aziz Ansari, Biz Markie, Matthew Broderick, Paul Rubens, Emo Phillips, Lou Ferrigno, Eric Estrada, Bobcat Goldthwait, Brian Posehn, and Brian Baumgartner all appear somewhere in the show's guest cast, an almost absurd accumulation of recognizable names folded into 11-minute episodes that most of their fans probably never sat down to watch specifically for them. Lou Ferrigno, most famous for playing the Hulk, voiced the legendary hero Billy across multiple appearances, giving weight and gravel to a character whose entire arc is about the gap between legend and the fragile, aging man underneath it. Weird Al aside, one of the more purely delightful pieces of stunt casting involved M. Emmett Walsh, one of the most respected character actors working in American film, voicing the Cosmic Owl. And here's where the story of that character gets almost too good to be a coincidence. The Cosmic Owl's design, one of the show's more visually striking and cosmically significant recurring figures, reportedly originated from an offhand observation in the Cartoon Network offices. As the story goes, while someone was in the studio restroom, they noticed that the reflection of the urinal handles resembled an owl's face and thought it looked like a genuinely good design. That casual, almost embarrassing observation became the visual seed for a character who ends up carrying real cosmic and emotional weight later in the series, including guilt over past events. The show reveals only gradually. It's hard to think of a better single example of how Adventure Time's most serious ideas kept growing out of its silliest impulses. Henry Rollins, the former Black Flag and Rollins Band frontman, voiced Bob Rainicorn, Lady Rainicorn's father, adding yet another layer of real-world music history to a character connected to a family whose matriarch, Lady herself, speaks exclusively in Korean throughout the entire run of the show. That's worth sitting with as its own fact. Lady Rainicorn speaks Korean, not broken English, not a fantasy language invented for the show, but real, spoken Korean, voiced by Nikki Yang, who is fluent in the language. The show never gave her a universal translator or a convenient narrative device that resolved the language barrier permanently. Jake, her partner, translated for her sometimes. Princess Bubblegum, in a detail that quietly signals the depth of her friendship with Jake and Lady, is shown to understand Korean herself. But for most of the audience, most of the time, you understood Lady Rainicorn through tone, through context, through the reactions of the people around her, not through subtitles or dubbing. That's a genuinely unusual choice for an English language children's program to make and then never walk back across 8 years and hundreds of episodes. Here's a fact about the writer's room itself that explains a great deal about why the show's tone could shift so fluidly between goofy slapstick and quiet devastation, sometimes within the same episode. The Adventure Time writing and storyboarding staff across its run included Rebecca Sugar, who would go on to create Steven Universe, Patrick McHale, who would go on to create Over the Garden Wall, J.G. Quintel, who created Regular Show, Ian Jones-Quartey, who created OKKO Let's Be Heroes, and Julia Pott, who created Summer Camp Island. That is an extraordinary concentration of future creators passing through the same production at overlapping points in their careers, and it means the writer's room functioned, whether anyone planned it this way or not, as something close to a finishing school for a generation of animation storytellers who would go on to make their own celebrated, distinctive shows elsewhere. Rebecca Sugar, in particular, deserves specific attention because she co-wrote and storyboarded some of the show's most quietly devastating episodes, including I Remember You, widely regarded as one of the strongest episodes the series ever produced. That episode, in which the Ice King unknowingly helps Marceline unearth notes. Simon Petrikov wrote to her 1,000 years earlier, was co-storyboarded by Sugar and Cole Sanchez, and it earned specific critical praise for the sheer economy of its storytelling, meaning nearly every beat in an 11-minute runtime earns its place with no wasted motion. Sugar also wrote original songs for the show, including Oh Fiona, used in an early Fiona and Cake episode, well before that concept ever became a full spin-off series in its own right. Natasha Allegri deserves her own dedicated stretch of facts because the entire Fiona and Cake concept, which eventually grew into a full HBO Max series, began as her creation. Allegri designed the original gender-swapped versions of Finn and Jake, reimagined as Fiona and Cake, and within the show's own internal logic, these characters exist as the fictional creations of the Ice King, written as a form of fan fiction he composes about the real heroes of Ooh. It's a remarkable structure once you notice it. Pendleton Ward built an entire recurring bit around the Ice King writing fan fiction, essentially turning fan creative culture itself into in-universe mythology, and Natasha Allegri, an artist working on the actual show, designed the characters for that fictional fan fiction. Years later, the eventual Fiona and Cake spin-off series reveals that the Ice King's fan fiction universe was, within the show's own mythology, secretly real all along, existing in a hidden pocket of the multiverse that had been concealed inside Simon Petrikov's damaged memory after he was freed from the crown. A joke about fan fiction became, over the span of roughly a decade, a fully realized alternate universe with its own multi-season television series. Few shows anywhere have taken an internal gag that seriously and let it grow that far. The Fiona and Cake spin-off series itself, released on Max, features Madeline Martin voicing Fiona and Roz Ryan voicing Cake, alongside returning voices including Felicia Day, who plays Betty Gruff, Donald Glover, Tom Kenny, John DiMaggio, and Olivia Olson. The composer for the spin-off is Amanda Jones, distinct from the composers who scored the original series, which is its own small piece of musical trivia worth knowing if you've ever wondered why the newer material has a subtly different sonic texture than the original run. Now, back to music in the original series itself, because the show's composers deserve real credit. Casey James Basikas and Tim Kiefer served as the primary composers across the original run, responsible for the incidental score that colors nearly every scene of the show, often shifting from playful to genuinely mournful within a matter of seconds to match the show's own emotional whiplash. The show's ending theme, distinct from the ukulele opening, is called Island Song, sometimes referred to by its lyric, Come Along With Me, performed by the band Lake, and it became so associated with the show's tone that the finale episode itself borrowed its title directly from that song's own refrain, a small but deliberate piece of structural symmetry between the very first sound most viewers ever heard from the show and the very last words its story left them with. Let's talk about awards for a moment, because the sheer scale of recognition Adventure Time received over its run tends to surprise people who remember it primarily as that weird cartoon. The series won 8 Primetime Emmy Awards, a Peabody Award, 3 Awards, 2 British Academy Children's Awards, a Motion Picture Sound Editors Award, and a Kerrang! Award, an award more commonly associated with rock music journalism than animated children's television, awarded here presumably for the show's musical contributions. Beyond wins, the show picked up nominations from the Critics' Choice Television Awards, the Annecy International Animated Film Festival, the Television Critics Association, and even a nomination connected to the Sundance Film Festival, an unusually prestigious constellation of recognition for a program that spent its first several seasons airing in kids' programming blocks squeezed between shows about talking sponges and teenage superheroes. There's a quieter, sadder piece of institutional history worth knowing, too. Adventure Time was produced by Cartoon Network Studios, working out of a physical studio building in Burbank that, for years, housed the creative teams behind not just Adventure Time, but Steven Universe and other beloved series from the same era of the network's history. That building eventually closed. Animation workers who had passed through it over the years have spoken publicly about what the space meant to them, describing it as a place that held enormous creative energy and personal history for an entire generation of artists, and its closure marked something like the end of an era for that specific chapter of American television animation, well beyond just the end of any one individual show. Speaking of endings, here's the plain, unglamorous business fact behind why the show repped when it did. Cartoon Network's chief content officer at the time described the decision as being made roughly 2 years before the finale actually aired, meaning the ending of the show wasn't a sudden cancellation so much as a planned, deliberate wind-down that the crew had time to build toward, which likely explains why the finale, Come Along With Me, manages to feel like an earned conclusion rather than an abrupt stop. The finale itself, once it aired, left the show with 283 episodes across 10 seasons, a genuinely enormous body of work for any animated series, let alone one that started as a rejected 7-minute short. The show's afterlife in comics deserves its own facts because it didn't simply end with the television finale. Boom! Studios began publishing Adventure Time comics in 2012, years before the show itself ended, running a New York Times best-selling line of comics and graphic novels that earned recognition, including Eisner, Harvey, and Diamond Gem Award honors. After the television series concluded, Boom launched a direct comic continuation called Adventure Time Season 11, picking up story threads from where the show left off, written initially by Ted Anderson and later, in a different iteration, by Eisner Award-winning writer Sonny Liu with art by Marina Julia, continuing the story of Ooh in the aftermath of events the animated finale had only begun to resolve. That comic continuation was eventually discontinued after declining sales, a reminder that even beloved properties don't automatically carry an audience across a change in medium, no matter how much fan affection the original show generated. There's a particularly sweet piece of trivia tucked into the comics side of the franchise. Olivia Olson, the actress who voiced Marceline for the entirety of the show's run, went on to write an actual comic book miniseries called Adventure Time, Marcy and Simon, working alongside artist Slim Fabert. The performer, who gave voice to one half of the show's most emotionally central relationship, eventually became one of the people writing that relationship's continued story on the page. A genuinely rare kind of full circle creative involvement for a voice actor to get in a franchise they helped originate. Now, for some of the show's more purely fun, purely hidden Easter eggs, the kind of details that reward only the most obsessive rewatching. There is a snail hidden somewhere in every single episode of Adventure Time, a running visual gag the crew maintained with genuine obsessive discipline across the entire series. Sometimes it's a background detail so small you'd need to pause and scan the frame to catch it. Sometimes, as longtime viewers eventually learn, that snail carries enormous narrative weight because it turns out to be the physical form the ancient cosmic entity known as the Lich occupies during his imprisonment, wandering harmlessly through the background of nearly every episode of the first season, waiting, patient beyond any human sense of patience, for the story to eventually need him again. The show's willingness to hide something that consequential inside a joke that's simple and to sustain the joke across an entire season before anyone realized what they'd actually been looking at tells you something about how this creative team thought about foreshadowing. It wasn't decoration, it was structure disguised as decoration. There's an episode, Pillow World, in which Finn's arm is shown transformed into a pillow, a gag that plays purely for laughs in the moment. Rewatch it after you already know that Finn eventually loses his actual right arm in a later season and regrows it through a complicated arc involving a grass sword, and the earlier pillow gag reads entirely differently, almost like the show quietly rehearsing an idea years before it needed to use it in earnest. Similarly, in the episode High Strangeness, a background detail shows a world population chart that, if you actually pause and read it, reveals a devastating dip in Earth's human population corresponding to the Mushroom War, alongside a smaller, subtler dip positioned roughly where the real-world Black Death would have occurred in the show's implied historical timeline. That's not a detail that serves any single joke or plot point. It's world building placed in the background purely for the sake of internal consistency, visible only to viewers willing to freeze the frame and actually read a prop. Ice King's browser history, visible in glimpses across certain episodes when his computer screen is shown, has become one of the most talked about hidden details among longtime fans, specifically because of what it implies about his loneliness and his confusion, containing search queries that read as pathetic and slightly unsettling at once. The kind of detail that works as a quick visual joke on first viewing and as something considerably sadder once you understand the character's full backstory. And here's a foreshadowing detail that genuinely surprises people when they learn how early it was planted. Gunter, the specific penguin the Ice King favors above his many other penguins, is treated in throwaway dialogue in an early season as something close to a running gag about how unassuming and unremarkable he seems. It isn't until season 6 that the show reveals Gunter is actually Orgolorg, an ancient cosmic entity known as the Breaker of Worlds, compressed by Earth's gravity into penguin form after a battle involving Mars associated deities in the deep past. Long before that reveal, in an earlier episode, another character identifies something in the vicinity of Gunter as, almost jokingly, one of the most evil things they'd ever encountered, a line that reads as pure comedic hyperbole on first watch and is remarkably precise, foreshadowing once you know what Gunter actually is. Let's talk, for a moment, about the international side of this show's life, because Adventure Time did not reach the rest of the world in the same form American audiences saw. It was heavily censored in numerous international markets, and Australia in particular became notorious among fans for having the most aggressively edited version of the show anywhere in the world, even though the same country's DVD and Blu-ray releases, distributed by Madman Entertainment, restored the content in full, uncensored form. Individual scenes were trimmed for content across markets, including the Philippines, Southeast Asia broadly, and the United Kingdom. In one instance, a line where Princess Bubblegum mentions having once dated Mr. Cream Puff was cut entirely in several regions. In another, dialogue was altered so that a slightly harsher phrase became a softer one, changing "you promised you wouldn't freaking tell anyone" into the milder "you promised you wouldn't tell anyone." An entire episode's musical number was replaced with a purely instrumental version in the Australian broadcast, with an animator's line drawn directly over Finn's mouth in one shot specifically to disguise the fact that he was singing at all in the original cut. Perhaps most strikingly, the Distant Lands special, Obsidian, built entirely around the confirmed romantic relationship between Princess Bubblegum and Marceline, was pulled from its scheduled broadcast slot in at least one international market, specifically because of that relationship, replaced at the last minute with a rerun of an unrelated episode, and in a detail with far heavier real-world stakes than any editing decision. The show was reportedly banned outright in Kenya in 2017, with the ban explicitly attributed by reporting at the time to the perception that the show was, in the phrasing used, pro-gay. A cartoon about a boy, his dog, and a candy kingdom ended up tangled in real international politics around queer representation, which is a strange and heavy thing for any children's program to carry, however unintentionally. Here's a fact about the Korean dub specifically that flips one of the show's most distinctive choices on its head. In the Korean language version of Adventure Time, Lady Rainicorn, the character who speaks exclusively in Korean throughout the entire American broadcast, speaks English instead. The joke and the intimacy of that language barrier only exists relative to whichever audience is watching, which is a small, strange reminder that a creative choice built around who understands what doesn't travel the same way once the underlying language of the broadcast itself changes. Let's return to the writer's room for a stretch of facts about how specific character designs and plot elements came to exist in forms very different from how they eventually aired. The Lich was originally going to be called the Lich King until, according to production trivia, the team altered the name to sidestep any trademark overlap with the World of Warcraft franchise, which features the major villain of the same title. The character also went through at least two full visual redesigns before the crew settled on his final, iconic look, and in his earliest appearances, before that final design was locked, he's actually referred to on screen by a different name entirely, a small continuity wrinkle that only shows up if you go back and rewatch his first appearances, specifically looking for it. The ending of the early episode Tree Trunks originally had the title character simply exploding after eating a crystal apple, full stop, no survival, no resolution. According to accounts of the show's development, Cartoon Network's own standards process required the crew to add a scene showing tree trunks alive and unharmed inside the crystal that formed around her, softening what would otherwise have been a surprisingly bleak note to end a children's episode on. Whether that network mandated addition later created a small continuity tension with a subsequent episode showing her fully alive and well is the kind of question that only the most detail obsessed corners of fandom bother litigating. But it's a real, documented piece of executive input shaping the show's earliest tone. Similarly, the episode His Hero originally had a very different ending planned, one in which the legendary hero Billy's throne was revealed once Billy finally stood up from it, to be concealing something dangerous sealed away underneath, in the style of a classic sealed evil in a can story beat. That ending never made it to air in that form, and the episode instead resolved more gently, though the discarded version gives you a glimpse of just how much darker some of the show's earliest instincts already were, well before most fans assume the series started leaning into genuine horror and tragedy. Deleted scenes and abandoned first appearances turn up throughout the show's development history. The episode The Enchiridion originally included a scene featuring the character Choose Goose, which would have marked his first appearance in the series, but the crew held that material back and saved his actual debut for the following season instead, presumably to give the character more room to land properly rather than getting buried inside an already dense early episode. Here's a piece of trivia about voice actors doubling up on multiple roles within the same show, a practice extremely common in animation, but rarely tracked by casual viewers. Steve Little, credited as a story writer on the series, also personally voiced Peppermint Butler, the Duke of Nuts, Turtle Princess, and Abracadaniel, meaning a single writer working behind the scenes on the show's scripts was also in the booth, responsible for the voices of several entirely distinct and tonally different characters. Tom Kenny, similarly, voiced not just the Ice King, but multiple additional roles across the run, a common enough practice in television animation that it barely registers as trivia inside the industry itself, but genuinely surprises viewers who assume, understandably, that one actor equals one character. Let's talk for a moment about how the show handled spoilers and marketing missteps, because there's a surprisingly long list of moments where the show's own network accidentally gave away plot details before episodes aired. A GameStop Canada advertisement reportedly showed footage from the episode The Comet before it had aired in North America. The DVD packaging for the Islands miniseries was posted online weeks ahead of Cartoon Network's own official reveal of the opening sequence on social media, and that same DVD cover ended up revealing, ahead of schedule, that Finn would be shown with a robotic arm, spoiling a significant plot development related to his lost limb before the relevant episodes had even aired. A promotional bumper for the show reportedly aired a short clip from the episode Always BMO Closing, a full 3 months before season nine's premiere, and that clip additionally revealed that Jake had returned to his original size and form, information that mattered a great deal given the storyline the network had most recently aired at that point. And in one particularly clumsy instance, Cartoon Network's own social media accounts reportedly spoiled the ending of the episode, The Wild Hunt, on both Facebook and Twitter, hours ahead of that episode's actual season 9 premiere. None of these are creative facts about the show itself, exactly, but they're a genuinely revealing window into just how much unpredictable, occasionally embarrassing chaos surrounds the marketing side of even a carefully constructed television production. There's also a fact tucked into the show's trivia about fan community behavior rather than the production itself, worth knowing because it shows how closely the fandom was watching from the very beginning. Pendleton Ward reportedly used to answer fan questions directly through the platform Formspring in the show's earlier years, engaging with the audience in a fairly informal, direct way that many showrunners of major network properties simply don't do. According to accounts of the period, he eventually stopped, having grown tired of fielding the same repeated questions over and over, which is an understandable, very human reason for a creator to step back from that kind of direct fan interaction, even if it meant losing a channel of communication that had, for a while, made the show feel unusually close to its audience. There's also a fact worth knowing about a controversy inside the fandom itself, distinct from anything the network or the crew did. The episode What Was Missing, which strongly implied a romantic history between Princess Bubblegum and Marceline well before the show's finale, confirmed that relationship outright, generated enough heated discussion and disagreement among viewers at the time that, according to trivia around the show's fan community, at least one prominent fan-run recap blog reportedly stopped producing episode recaps altogether in the aftermath, apparently worn down by the volume and intensity of the reaction. That's a small, telling artifact of just how emotionally invested this show's audience had already become, years before the story ever gave them full confirmation of what they suspected. Let's go back to the physical mechanics of the animation one more time, because there's a specific technical fact that explains something a lot of longtime viewers notice without ever quite naming it. The show's animation was produced with characters whose limbs and bodies have a slightly loose, jiggly quality, most noticeable in Finn and Jake's arms, an effect that became less pronounced as the show's visual style tightened up in later seasons. When Adventure Time, the animated movie, was produced as a theatrical feature, that specific jiggly arm quality, which had mostly faded from the show's later television seasons, was deliberately reintroduced for the movie, appearing there for what trivia around the film describes as the first time since season 1. It's a strange, specific example of a production consciously reaching backward into its own earlier visual habits for a single feature length project, treating a stylistic quirk almost like a piece of continuity worth honoring rather than something to simply leave behind as the show matured. That theatrical movie is itself worth a cluster of facts on its own. It was released on May 16th, 2014, in the United States and Canada, making it the only Adventure Time film to receive an actual theatrical release on the big screen. It grossed a little over $42 million worldwide against a $50 million budget, numbers that tell their own quiet story about how the economics of the project worked out relative to expectations. The film's events are set during the second and third seasons of the show's television timeline, meaning it functions as something closer to an interstitial adventure than a culminating one. And it was animated by the same Rough Draft Korea and Seorom animation teams responsible for the television series itself, maintaining visual continuity between the film and the show it was drawn from. The film's color and shading were made noticeably brighter than the television series, a change attributed to the movie being produced in a widescreen 16 by 9 aspect ratio rather than the show's standard broadcast format. It also marked the return of the ancient psychic tandem war elephant, a character who had not appeared since a season 2 episode, brought back specifically for this feature-length outing. The film received a PG rating in its American theatrical release, while its Canadian broadcast rating on Teletoon and Cartoon Network Canada carried a distinct C8 classification, a small piece of cross-border ratings trivia that most audiences never think to compare. Let's move to the Distant Lands specials, because they represent a genuinely distinct chapter of the show's production history, made specifically for HBO Max and airing well after the original series finale had already aired. 4 specials were produced under that banner, beginning in June of 2020. The first, focused entirely on BMO, sends the character on a solo adventure occurring in a gap of time between the main series and its ultimate resolution, giving BMO a full, standalone protagonist arc the main series had never had room to provide. The second, titled Obsidian, follows Marceline and Princess Bubblegum, largely set after the main series timeline, and gives their relationship the fuller, more explicit resolution that years of subtext had been building toward. The third, Together Again, addresses the reunion of Finn and Jake in an afterlife setting and notably shifts its animation style, specifically for those afterlife sequences, adopting a more surreal, abstract visual language to signal that the ordinary rules of the show's reality no longer apply in that space. The fourth, Wizard City, follows Peppermint Butler at a school for wizards and stands as the lightest, most purely comedic of the 4 specials, offering something closer to old-fashioned Adventure Time silliness after 3 specials that each carried considerable emotional weight. Here's a piece of casting trivia specific to those specials that longtime fans tend to find quietly moving. In Together Again, an older version of Finn is voiced by David Bradley, a respected veteran actor recognizable from a wide range of film and television work, brought in specifically to voice Finn in old age, distinct from Jonathan Frakes, who had separately voiced adult versions of Finn in earlier appearances across the main series, multiple actors across multiple points in Finn's life ultimately gave voice to the character as he aged, which mirrors, in its own way, the show's earlier decision to simply let Jeremy Shada's real voice mature on air rather than artificially preserving a younger register through recasting. Let's return one more time to Rebecca Sugar's specific musical contributions because the show's songwriting deserves recognition as its own distinct craft. Separate from the storyboarding and writing work the crew is more commonly credited for. The song performed in I Remember You, built from notes Simon Petrikov wrote to Marceline before he lost himself entirely to the crown, was performed by Olivia Olson, whose own real-world musical background as a singer informed the specificity and control of that vocal performance. The episode uses that song as its structural and emotional center, and its critical reception at the time, and in the years since, consistently singles it out as one of the strongest pieces of music the show ever produced, treated by fans and critics alike less as incidental scoring and more as a genuine freestanding piece of songwriting that happens to exist inside a cartoon. There's a specific piece of trivia about a different musical choice in the 5th season episode, Simon and Marcy, that rewards knowing the real-world source material behind it. In that episode, Simon, trying to comfort a young, sick Marceline in the ruins shortly after the Mushroom War, sings the theme song from the American sitcom Cheers to Her, performing it inside the hollow shell of a broken television set as a kind of improvised puppet show. That theme song, Where Everybody Knows Your Name, was written by Gary Portnoy and Judy Hart Angelo, and it's one of the most widely recognized television theme songs in American broadcast history. Using it here works on 2 levels simultaneously. It's a specific joke aimed at adult viewers who grew up with that older show, and it's also a genuinely poignant narrative choice on its own terms. Since the song is explicitly about belonging and being known, sung by a man to a child, in the wreckage of a world where that kind of belonging has just been violently destroyed, the show trusted its audience to feel both of those registers at once, without explaining either one. Let's talk about the show's relationship to Frederator Studios and Fred Seibert specifically, because that production company's role in the show's existence tends to get flattened into a single line in most casual retellings. Fred Seibert served as an executive producer across the show's run, and he's the person on record describing an internal effort by Cartoon Network to reduce the prominence of Princess Bubblegum and Marceline's relationship, reportedly motivated, at least in part, by the volume of complaints the network was receiving from more conservative viewer groups reacting to the strong subtext already present in early seasons. That internal pressure existed for years, quietly, while the show kept building toward a finale that eventually confirmed the relationship anyway, in full view of the exact audience that pressure had originally been meant to appease. Here's a fact worth sitting with about the show's broader legacy inside the animation industry, separate from any single episode or character. Adventure Time is frequently credited across critical writing and industry retrospectives with helping to open the door for a wave of animated television that treated younger audiences as capable of handling genuine emotional complexity ambiguity, and darkness without abandoning humor or warmth. Novelist Lev Grossman, writing for NPR after the Holly Jolly Secrets episodes revealed the connection between the Ice King and Simon Petrikov, described his own reaction to that reveal by connecting it directly to his father's experience with Alzheimer's disease, saying, in effect, that the cartoon had suddenly become, for him, a story about his own father dying. That's not a small thing for any piece of children's television to accomplish, and it's the kind of reaction that doesn't happen by accident. It happens because a specific group of artists, working under specific creative and technical constraints, made a long series of deliberate choices, season after season, about exactly how much honesty a cartoon aimed at kids could actually hold. One more cluster of names worth naming clearly, because they don't always get the same spotlight as the show's most famous alumni. Jesse Moynihan, Kent Osborne, Cole Sanchez, Tom Herpich, Akko Castuera, and Steve Wolfhard all worked as writers and storyboard artists across the show's run, shaping specific episodes and character arcs that ranged from purely comedic to genuinely mythic in scope. Adam Muto, who had worked on the show from its earliest days as a co-writer and storyboard artist, took over as showrunner starting in season 5 or 6, depending on how the transition is dated, after Pendleton Ward, by his own account, found the stress of directing dozens of people and running a major production too much for his more introverted temperament, and quietly stepped back into more behind-the-scenes creative roles rather than continuing as the show's day-to-day leader. Muto ran the show from that point forward, and here's the part that tends to surprise people. Most casual viewers never notice the change in leadership at all, because the show's tone, its mixture of silliness and darkness, its willingness to let a joke curdle into something heartbreaking without warning, stayed remarkably consistent across that transition. That continuity is itself a kind of achievement, evidence that the show's identity had, by that point, become bigger than any single person steering it. Let's talk finally about a strange little category of facts: the show's connections to games and interactive media, since Adventure Time's world extended well past the television screen during its run. A tabletop version of the classic deck-building game Munchkin was released as an official Adventure Time spin-off, and it preserved the show's hidden snail Easter egg tradition directly into its physical card design, continuing a running joke from the television show into a completely different medium. Beyond that, the franchise spawned numerous licensed video games across handheld and console platforms throughout its television run, part of the broader wave of merchandising that any hit Cartoon Network property of that era generated, alongside toys, apparel, and the comics line already discussed. Here's a small, specific fact about censorship that reads almost like dark comedy on its own. In the episode Storytelling, a line of dialogue in which Finn essentially complains that a tea party sucks in a big way was altered for certain international broadcasts into the far blander "this tea party in a big way," an edit that strips the sentence of both its complaint and, arguably, its basic grammatical sense, leaving behind a fragment that barely qualifies as a coherent line. It's the kind of edit that exists purely to satisfy a content standard, rather than to actually improve or clarify anything. And it's a good reminder that broadcast censorship, in practice, is very rarely as clean or as sensible as the standards documents behind it might suggest. There's also a genuinely unusual piece of trivia connected to how Netflix, specifically, has handled parts of the show's back catalog. According to accounts of the streaming release, the ending of the early episode, Tree Trunks, the same episode whose original ending was altered at the network's request during initial production, had a specific shot removed from its Netflix version, showing Tree Trunks, the elephant walking around happily inside the crystal dimension after her earlier explosion, for reasons that remain unclear even to fans who track this kind of platform-specific editing closely. It's a small example of how a show's available text can keep quietly shifting for years after the original broadcast has ended, shaped now by licensing and platform decisions, rather than the original creative or standards choices that shaped it the first time around. Let's close this particular stretch with one more piece of casting trivia that ties several earlier facts together in a satisfying way. Jonathan Frakes, known to a huge swath of television audiences as Commander Riker from Star Trek The Next Generation, and later as a respected director in his own right, voiced an adult version of Finn in certain appearances across the main series, adding yet another recognizable, well-established performer to a guest and recurring cast that, by the time the show wrapped, had quietly become one of the most stacked ensembles in the history of American animated television, assembled 11 minutes at a time, episode after episode, almost never advertised as the achievement it actually was. Let's stay with the guest cast a little longer, because the list genuinely doesn't stop where you'd expect it to. Kumail Nanjiani, Felicia Day, Maria Bamford, Duncan Trussell, Alia Shawkat, Alan Tudyk, Dave Foley, Amy Sedaris, Keith David, Gray Delisle, and Melissa Villaseñor all lent their voices to characters across the show's run, some for a single episode, some recurring across seasons, without most viewers ever connecting the performance to the name behind it. Felicia Day, in particular, deserves a second mention beyond her guest role as Betty Groff, because that casting eventually became one of the show's most quietly important pieces of long-term storytelling, given how central Betty's sacrifice becomes to the entire arc of Simon Petrikov's freedom in the finale. Maurice LaMarche, a veteran voice actor known to generations of animation fans for his work on shows like Pinky and the Brain, voiced the Grandmaster Wizard and a character called Bella Noche, among other roles, folding yet another instantly recognizable voice actor's career into the show's enormous, quietly accumulated cast list. Keith David, whose deep, instantly identifiable voice has anchored everything from Gargoyles to major video game franchises, appears in the credits as well. One more example of the show reaching into the working history of American voice acting almost indiscriminately, grabbing whichever performer fit a given role rather than sticking to a narrow, predictable pool of talent. Here's a specific fact about hand-drawn animation talent that tends to astonish people who care about the craft side of the medium. James Baxter, one of the most respected traditional character animators in the history of American animation, Known for his work on Disney features during the studio's late 20th century Renaissance, contributed guest animation to select scenes of the show at least once during its run. That's an animator whose career includes work most people associate with feature film quality character acting, brought in, even briefly, to lend his hand to 11 minutes of Cartoon Network programming, which tells you something about how seriously certain corners of the animation industry had come to regard this show's craft, not just its writing. There's a piece of season by season structural trivia worth knowing simply because it clarifies how unevenly the show's output was actually distributed across its 10-season run, something that surprises people who assume every season was roughly the same length. The second season consisted of 26 half-hour episodes. The third season also ran 26 episodes, as did the fourth. The fifth season expanded dramatically to 52 episodes, nearly double the output of the seasons immediately before it. The sixth season pulled back somewhat to 43 episodes, and the seventh dropped further still to 39. That fifth season expansion in particular represents the peak of the show's sheer production volume, a stretch of the series where the creative team was generating new material at a pace most half-hour animated comedies rarely attempt to sustain for more than a single season, let alone as one entry in a run that eventually reached 283 episodes total. Let's talk about the specific tools sitting on the desks of the animators themselves, since that's a detail almost nobody outside the industry ever thinks to ask about. Multiple accounts of the production describe artists working with Wacom Cintiq tablets, devices that let an artist draw directly onto a screen rather than on a separate tablet surface disconnected from the image itself, a piece of hardware that had become fairly standard across professional animation studios by the time Adventure Time was in full production. Even so, the show's fundamental character animation largely stayed rooted in traditional, frame-by-frame drawing practices, rather than the more heavily rigged, reusable asset styles of animation that dominate a large share of contemporary American television cartoons, which is part of why the character movement in Adventure Time so often reads as slightly loose, slightly handmade, even in scenes with relatively little actual motion happening on screen. Now, a cluster of Easter eggs that live purely in the realm of sly, affectionate cultural reference, the kind of thing the crew clearly built for their own amusement as much as for the audience's. The Crystal Citadel, a location that appears within the show's world, has a visual design that fans and critics alike have noted bears a strong resemblance to the Crystal Palace from the Final Fantasy video game series, a nod that reads as a genuine wink toward the childhoods of the artists who built it, rather than a licensed crossover of any kind. Finn's green backpack, a near-constant fixture across the entire run of the show, has been pointed to repeatedly as a visual echo of the talking backpack carried by Dora the Explorer, another Nickelodeon-adjacent children's character, though Adventure Time's version never speaks and never winks at the audience the way Dora's does, keeping the reference subtle enough that it functions as a design choice rather than a joke told out loud. The recurring cosmic dance party sequence, featuring the party god, includes a dance move that fans have specifically identified as a direct homage to the so-called Carlton dance, the signature move popularized by actor Alfonso Ribeiro's character on The Fresh Prince of Bel-Air, smuggled into a cosmic, mythologically loaded sequence about as far removed from a 1990s sitcom living room as a piece of animation could possibly get. BMO, the small robot who lives with Finn and Jake, is shown at various points playing or referencing games clearly modeled on classic video game aesthetics, a running design choice that ties BMO's entire identity, quite literally, to the history of the medium the character was originally built to represent, since BMO was, before becoming something closer to family, constructed as a video game console. Here's a fact specifically about the Lich's dialogue that's worth knowing purely as a piece of writing craft. The character has a specific, recurring catchphrase delivered across multiple appearances in a slow, ritualistic cadence: fall, crawl, conquer, crown. That four-word progression functions almost like a liturgical chant rather than ordinary villain dialogue, and its rhythm, each word landing on its own beat, was clearly written with performance and sound in mind as much as meaning, giving Ron Perlman's already gravelly delivery something structured and musical to work with rather than a generic threat. Let's spend some time on a specific behind-the-scenes account of a real production challenge the crew faced and how they worked around it. According to trivia collected around the show's production, the team responsible for developing the opening title sequence went through more than one significant revision before settling on the final version audiences know. On early concept, described in accounts of the show's development as too chaotic or nonsensical even by the show's own standards, was set aside in favor of something more visually structured, and the eventual sequence drew stylistic inspiration from both The Simpsons' iconic opening and the visual sensibility of Pee-wee's Playhouse, two very different but equally influential pieces of American television comedy. That a show this strange still needed to dial back its opening sequence for being too strange is a small funny piece of evidence about just how far this creative team's baseline instincts already sat outside the mainstream, even at the earliest planning stages. There's also a fact worth knowing about how close the show came to premiering under different timing entirely. According to a development update from Frederator's Fred Seibert, dating back to November of 2008, the series was originally planned to premiere in late 2009, roughly half a year earlier than it actually did. The eventual premiere was pushed to April of 2010 instead, a delay of a few months that, in hindsight, changed nothing about the show's eventual trajectory. But that stands as a reminder that even a project this beloved in retrospect went through the same kind of scheduling churn and internal delay that affects almost every television production, hit or otherwise. Here's a fact about the show's relationship with its own past that quietly rewards long-term attention. According to production trivia, one of the show's staff members jokingly nicknamed a specific shape-shifting character who appears in the episode Joshua and Margaret Investigates, and who turns out to be connected to Jake's biological origins, the Peeper, an informal, in-house name for a character whose eventual on-screen identity carries real narrative weight. Treated casually behind the scenes, the way any long running creative team ends up giving pet nicknames to even their most significant creations. Let's take a moment on something specific to Five Short Grables, a season 4 episode built as an anthology of 5 miniature stories. According to trivia around the episode, a preview published by TV Guide ahead of its broadcast reportedly revealed that the 5 stories inside the episode were structured around the 5 human senses: sight, touch, taste, smell, and hearing information. The episode itself was apparently designed to reveal only in its own closing moments as a kind of quiet, cumulative realization. Having that structural reveal spoiled ahead of time by an outside publication reportedly dulled the impact of a specific closing line in the episode that was meant to land as a small, satisfying aha moment for anyone watching without knowing the twist already. It's a tiny, very human example of how promotional coverage, even well intentioned coverage, can accidentally undercut the exact kind of quiet structural surprise that a show like this specialized in. Now, a fact about the show's relationship to gender and identity that shows up specifically in casting rather than storyline. Neil Patrick Harris, openly gay in his real life, was the very first actor to voice Prince Gumball, the Fiona and Cake universe counterpart to Princess Bubblegum, years before that character's eventual on-screen relationship with Marshall Lee, Marceline's counterpart, was ever depicted. That earlier casting choice reads, in retrospect, almost like the show quietly building toward a piece of representation before the narrative itself had caught up to make that representation explicit, a pattern that echoes in a different register the years of subtext. The show carried around Princess Bubblegum and Marceline themselves before the finale confirmed their relationship outright. There's a specific fact about early character design worth knowing regarding Fiona and Cake's creator. Natasha Allegri worked as a background painter and character designer on Adventure Time itself before her Fiona and Cake designs became a recurring feature of the show, and she later went on to create her own animated series, Bee and Puppy Cat, drawing a direct visual and tonal lineage from her time working inside the world of Ooh. When the eventual Fiona and Cake spin-off series entered production years later, reviewers specifically noted its visual debts to Bee and Puppy Cat's style, a small but clear example of an artist's personal creative voice traveling from one project into another, and then, years later, back again into a franchise she'd originally helped shape from a supporting role. Here's a fact about the specific writers behind key mythology-heavy episodes that clarifies who was actually steering the show's more cosmic, high-concept material. The 2-part episode event, known as Holly Jolly Secrets, which first revealed the connection between the Ice King and Simon Petrikov through the video diaries Finn and Jake discover, aired in December of 2011 during the show's 3rd season and represents one of the clearest turning points in critical and audience perception of the series. The moment when a show largely understood as an oddball kids comedy was widely recognized as something considerably more ambitious. The reaction that followed, including Lev Grossman's widely cited NPR piece connecting the reveal to his own father's experience with Alzheimer's, helped shift broader cultural conversation about the show almost overnight, even though the crew themselves had clearly been building toward that reveal methodically, embedding Simon's VHS tapes and the visual continuity between his human face and the Ice King's face well before the episode finally connected the two on screen. Let's spend a moment on Frederator Studios itself as a company, since its role in the broader ecosystem around the show tends to get compressed into a footnote. Frederator, founded and led by Fred Seibert, had a long-standing relationship with Cartoon Network dating back to other properties, including its earlier work developing animated shorts and pitches through incubator-style programs designed to test small concepts before greenlighting them into full series. Adventure Time's original 7-minute short existed specifically because of that incubator model, meaning the entire franchise owes its existence not just to Pendleton Ward's individual creative vision, but to an entire pre-existing studio infrastructure built around giving young, unproven artists a low-risk venue to prove a concept could work before anyone committed real money to a full series order. There's a fact about the specific process behind how episodes moved from initial pitch to finished storyboard that deserves a slightly longer look, because it explains something structural about why so many Adventure Time episodes feel simultaneously loose and tightly constructed at the same time. After a storyboard artist finished their week of thumbnailing, roughing out the entire episode's action and dialogue from a bare outline, the showrunner and creative directors reviewed that draft and issued notes, sending the artist back to revise specific sequences before the episode moved into full boarding and then eventually into the overseas animation pipeline in Seoul. That means the writers most casual viewers never hear named. The individual storyboard artists assigned to a given episode were functioning as something much closer to co-writers than the credits alone might suggest, since the specific jokes, the specific line deliveries, and often the specific emotional beats of an episode were being generated and refined by whichever artist happened to be thumbnailing that particular script that particular week. Here's a fact about the show's relationship to Dungeons and Dragons and tabletop role-playing culture, since that influence shows up more directly in the show's DNA than casual viewers might expect. Adventure Time drew explicit inspiration from fantasy role-playing games and video games broadly, a lineage that shows up not just in obvious surface details like magic items, dungeons, and quest structures, but in the show's entire underlying sensibility, its comfort with absurd, improvisational feeling scenarios that escalate from a small starting premise into something much larger in the way a good tabletop session often does. Let's return to the international side of the show's life for one more specific, quietly remarkable fact. In 2023, the series became available on Netflix in a number of countries, including Spain, Portugal, Poland, and across Latin America, with dubbing produced specifically for those markets, and crucially, without the censorship that had characterized many earlier international broadcasts of the show through Cartoon Network's own regional channels. Though this particular Netflix release reportedly covered only 4 of the show's 10 seasons rather than the complete run. That detail matters because it means, even years after the original broadcast ended, the show's actual availability and completeness has continued shifting from country to country and platform to platform, a reminder that a series this large doesn't have one single, stable, complete home video or streaming presence the way people sometimes assume older, catalog friendly shows do. There's a fact about awards worth adding specifically because of how it complicates the show's reputation as a purely cult, under the radar property. Beyond the Emmy, Peabody, Annie, and BAFTA recognition already mentioned, Adventure Time Comics, published by Boom. Studios separately picked up Eisner, Harvey, and Diamond Gem Award honors, meaning the franchise collected serious industry recognition across two entirely distinct creative mediums: television animation and print comics, essentially running two parallel award histories at once, one for the show and one for its comic book continuation, both accumulating real critical prestige rather than simply the affection of a devoted internet fan base. Let's close out this stretch of trivia with a fact about the show's ending theme one more time, because there's a small, satisfying piece of structural symmetry worth naming explicitly before we start winding down. The finale of the entire series was titled Come Along With Me, borrowing its name directly from a lyric in Island Song, the closing theme performed by the band Lake that had played in under the credits of nearly every single episode across the show's entire run. That means the very last words most viewers ever heard associated with the show's ending, the title of its actual final episode, had already been sitting quietly inside the credits of hundreds of episodes before that, repeated over and over across 8 years of broadcast, waiting for its moment to become the title of the story's actual conclusion. Nobody watching those early seasons had any way of knowing that a phrase buried in a fading credits song would eventually become the name the whole story ended on. That's not a coincidence you can engineer casually. Someone at some point, years before the finale was written, must have already known where this was going, or at least suspected it, closely enough to plant the phrase and trust that it would still be there, waiting when the time finally came to use it properly. Let's go a little further into the comics, because the print side of this franchise had its own cast of creators who deserve to be named the way the television crew usually is. Writer Ryan North helmed a significant run of the main Adventure Time comic series for Boom Studios, and Meredith Gran wrote a dedicated spin-off comic titled Adventure Time, Marceline and the Scream Queens, giving Marceline's own band, mentioned only briefly on screen, an entire miniseries built around her life as a working musician rather than just a vampire queen with a bass guitar. Natasha Allegri, already responsible for designing Fiona and Cake for the television show, also wrote and drew a dedicated Adventure Time, Fiona and Cake comic series, meaning she got to shape those characters across two entirely separate creative mediums. First as a supporting designer on someone else's television show, and later as the primary creative voice behind their own standalone print continuity. In 2018, to mark the franchise reaching its 100th issue in comic form, Boom Studios partnered with the Charity Hero Initiative, an organization that assists comic book creators facing medical or financial hardship, on a special project inviting 100 different artists from around the world to each contribute a unique variant cover for that landmark issue, turning a simple publishing milestone into a genuine act of industry-wide charitable collaboration. There's a fact about the franchise's presence at comic conventions worth including here, since it's the kind of detail that only shows up if you were physically present or dug through convention archives afterward. Boom! Studios maintained a dedicated booth presence at New York Comic Con specifically to sell exclusive Adventure Time merchandise, situating that booth near the front of the convention floor in a location typically reserved for high-traffic franchise properties, alongside programming that brought in special guests from well beyond the world of comics, including performers connected to professional wrestling appearing on panels tied to the brand. That's a strange, slightly funny collision of fandoms, wrestling personalities sharing convention floor space with Adventure Time creators, but it speaks to just how broadly the franchise's audience had spread by the time these conventions were happening, well past the specific demographic Cartoon Network had originally built the show to reach. Let's talk about a detail connected to Ako Castuera specifically, since her name tends to get mentioned only in passing, even though her contributions to the show were substantial. Castuera worked as a writer and storyboard artist across multiple seasons, and also voiced a character named Canyon within the show itself, another example of the blurred line between the people writing and drawing Adventure Time and the people whose voices ended up embedded inside it. Her work, alongside colleagues like Jesse Moynihan, helped shape some of the show's stranger, more visually experimental episodes, the kind that leaned less on traditional joke structure and more on pure tonal atmosphere, a sensibility that shows up clearly in some of the show's most beloved Vibes episodes, the ones fans often cite specifically for how they feel rather than for any particular plot point. Here's a specific fact about the show's relationship with censorship that goes beyond individual line edits and into entire episodes being pulled from broadcast. According to detailed accounts of the show's international censorship history, an episode involving a character named James falling from a cliff, alongside a scene depicting a banana guard stabbing himself, was refused a standard broadcast slot on Cartoon Network Australia entirely, due to its darker sacrificial content, though it was eventually permitted to air specifically as a Halloween special beginning in 2014, treated as acceptable within that seasonal, horror-adjacent programming context, in a way it apparently wasn't considered acceptable as ordinary weekday content. That's a strange, telling piece of evidence about how broadcast standards bodies sometimes treat identical content differently, depending purely on the calendar date attached to its airing, as though October itself grants a kind of temporary permission that the rest of the year withholds. There's also a fact about a different kind of edit specific to the Philippines broadcast worth including, because it involves a word rather than a whole scene. According to detailed censorship trivia, the word asexually, used in a specific piece of dialogue, was cut entirely from at least one episode's broadcast in that market, alongside a separate edit removing a shot of Finn kicking a candy orphan, two edits with wildly different levels of severity bundled into the same single episode's list of regional changes, which gives you a sense of just how granular and sometimes seemingly arbitrary this kind of line by line broadcast standards review could get. Let's bring in one more piece of voice cast trivia, specifically about doubling roles within a single episode, since it's a good illustration of just how much unseen labor a small voice cast can carry on any given week of production. D. Bradley Baker, a voice actor whose career includes an enormous range of work across American animation, voiced Cinnamon Bun, among other characters in the Adventure Time cast list, and like several of his castmates, took on multiple minor and recurring roles across different episodes, rather than being limited to a single defined character, a normal practice in the industry, but one that means the credited voice count for any given episode often undersells just how few actual people were in that recording booth on a given day. Here's a fact worth naming clearly about how the show's crew handled its own sense of humor around real-world corporate concerns. The trademark-driven renaming of the Lich, shifting away from an original conception closer to Lich King, specifically to avoid overlap with a major existing video game franchise, is a small, very ordinary piece of the entertainment business, the kind of legal housekeeping that happens behind the scenes on countless productions without ever becoming public knowledge. That it did become public knowledge here, passed along through fan-compiled trivia, and eventually corroborated across multiple sources, says something about how thoroughly this particular fandom went looking for every scrap of behind-the-scenes information it could find, treating even a minor trademark dodge as worth preserving and repeating for years afterward. Let's include one more fact about the show's music that ties back to Casey James Basichis specifically, since his contributions sometimes get folded entirely into Tim Kiefer's more frequently cited name. Basichis worked alongside Kiefer as a credited composer across the series, and the two split scoring duties in a way that isn't always broken down cleanly episode by episode in public credits, meaning the show's incidental score, the music underneath dialogue and action, rather than the standalone songs performed by characters, represents a genuinely collaborative body of work between at least two distinct composing voices working in tandem across the show's entire 10-season run, shaping the emotional undercurrent of literally hundreds of individual episodes. There's a fact worth including about the show's relationship to its own crew members' post-Adventure Time careers that goes slightly beyond the most famous names already mentioned. Steve Wolfhard, credited as a writer across multiple seasons, went on to create his own comic and animation work following his time on the show, continuing a pattern that repeats across an unusually large share of the Adventure Time creative staff, in which people who cut their teeth on this specific production went on to lead their own distinct projects rather than simply moving laterally into other people's shows. That pattern, repeated across roughly a dozen names by the time you account for Sugar, McHale, Quintel, Jones-Quartey, Pott, Allegri, and Wolfhard together, suggests something genuinely unusual about the creative culture Pendleton Ward and his earliest collaborators built inside that Burbank studio, a culture that seems to have functioned less like a typical hierarchical writer's room and more like an incubator in its own right, echoing, on a smaller scale, the exact kind of low-risk, high creative freedom environment that had given Ward himself his first real shot through Frederator years earlier. Let's add a final specific fact about the show's approach to closed captioning, since it's a small, easily overlooked detail that reveals just how inconsistent the censorship process could be even within a single broadcast pipeline. According to detailed trivia on the show's international censorship history, there are documented instances where a line of dialogue was removed from the audio track of a given international broadcast, yet the closed captioning for that same broadcast still displayed the original, uncensored line of text, meaning viewers relying on captions in certain markets occasionally had access to dialogue that viewers relying purely on the audio did not. A genuine crack in the censorship process that nobody seems to have caught and closed during the relevant broadcast window. Here's one more piece of trivia specifically about the show's presence in Kenya, since the earlier fact about its 2017 ban deserves a small amount of additional context. Reporting from the period attributes the ban specifically to government-level content regulators, objecting to what they characterized as pro-LGBTQ messaging within the show, a characterization that, whatever you make of it, ties directly back to the same years of accumulated subtext around Princess Bubblegum and Marceline that Fred Seibert has separately confirmed Cartoon Network itself had once tried to quietly minimize under different pressure from a different direction entirely. The same relationship that one set of executives in the United States reportedly wanted toned down for domestic broadcast ended up, years later, becoming the stated reason an entire national government pulled the show from air on another continent altogether, which is a genuinely strange, almost dizzying example of how a single creative choice inside a cartoon can end up mattering in completely different, completely unrelated political contexts, thousands of miles apart, for reasons the original storyboard artist, thumbnailing that first hint of a relationship, almost certainly never imagined they'd be responsible for. Let's spend a little more time on the people who kept the show running once Pendleton Ward stepped back from day-to-day leadership, because Adam Muto's own creative fingerprints on the back half of the series tend to get less attention than they deserve. Muto had been embedded in the production since its earliest days, co-writing and storyboarding episodes alongside Ward well before he ever took over the showrunner title, which means his eventual leadership wasn't an outside hire stepping into someone else's vision, but a continuation by someone who had helped build that vision from the inside, episode by episode, for years. Under Muto's direction, the show leaned further into serialized storytelling than its earlier, more episodic seasons had, building the kind of long arc plotting around the Lich, Prismo, Golb, and the eventual Great Gum War that gave later seasons of the show a very different rhythm than the standalone adventure format that had defined its first couple of years on air. That shift in structure wasn't accidental, and it maps almost exactly onto the leadership transition, giving fans watching closely a fairly clean, if unofficial, dividing line between what people sometimes call the show's earlier, sillier era and its later, more mythologically ambitious one. Here's a fact about a specific recurring bit of stunt casting worth naming on its own. Andy Samberg, primarily known for his work with the comedy group The Lonely Island and his years on Saturday Night Live, voiced Party Pat, as well as a separate character called Rap Bear. giving a comedian best known for musical parody sketches a chance to bring that same improvisational, slightly unhinged comic and energy into a children's cartoon without ever needing to explain or contextualize it for younger viewers who had no idea who he was outside of Ooh. There's a fact worth including about how the show handled continuity errors when they did slip through, since even a production this carefully thumbnailed and reviewed wasn't immune to the occasional slip. According to detailed trivia compiled by longtime viewers, small inconsistencies do exist across the run, involving details like character heights, background object placement, or minor color errors on recurring props. The kind of thing every long running animated series accumulates simply as a function of hundreds of different artists across two countries, drawing thousands of individual frames over the better part of a decade. The show's fans have documented these inconsistencies extensively rather than treating them as embarrassments, which fits the broader spirit of a series that, from its very first 30 seconds of audible keyboard typing, always seemed more interested in being genuine than in being flawless. Let's end this particular stretch on a fact that brings us back one more time to where we started tonight. That original 7-minute short film, the one Pendleton Ward pitched with a guitar in his hands, singing the theme song live in a room full of executives, deciding whether any of this deserved to exist, aired for the very first time on January 11th, 2007. Everything else in this entire 150 facts, the Emmys, the Peabody, the international bands, the backmasked farewell messages, the real fathers voicing fictional fathers, the puberty nobody edited around, the snail hiding in every frame, all of it traces back to a single afternoon in a single meeting room where a young, largely unproven artist decided the best way to convince a room full of strangers that his weird little world was worth funding was to simply pick up an instrument and sing to them. That's not a metaphor. That's just what happened. And it's very hard, once you know that, to watch even the goofiest, silliest, most throwaway episode of this show without hearing, somewhere underneath it, the faint sound of someone still willing to sing the pitch out loud rather than just describe it. One last cluster of facts before we get to the end of this, because a few names deserve a proper mention rather than a passing one. Kent Osborne, who wrote and storyboarded across a huge span of the series and also voiced multiple characters himself, was involved in shaping some of the show's most quietly influential early structural choices, working alongside Pendleton Ward from close to the very beginning of the series development. Patrick McHale, before he left to build Over the Garden Wall, was part of the story team behind some of the show's earliest, strangest, most tonally adventurous episodes, and the backmasked farewell message, hidden inside Heat Signature, the one addressed to someone heading off to New York, lines up closely enough with McHale's own eventual departure from the West Coast that longtime fans have long assumed, without ever getting official confirmation, that the message was meant for him specifically. Whether or not that assumption is correct in every detail, it's exactly the kind of quiet, undocumented mystery this show's own production history tends to generate. Small, unresolved questions sitting right alongside the fully confirmed facts, refusing to resolve themselves neatly even decades later. And that, honestly, Feels like the right note for a production history like this one to end on, since the show itself was never especially interested in tidiness either. It preferred leaving a few things a little open, a little uncertain, trusting whoever was paying close enough attention to sit with the not knowing rather than demanding an answer for everything. There's one more name worth sitting with before we let this one go, and it isn't a name attached to a single fact so much as a name that sits underneath almost all of them. Every one of these 150 details, the puberty nobody hid, the snail nobody removed, the father who voiced the father, the theme song recorded once and never fixed, exists because a specific group of specific people showed up to a specific building in Burbank for years and made specific choices, one storyboard panel at a time, that could easily have gone a different way. There was no guarantee any of this would matter. A rejected pilot doesn't usually come back. A showrunner stepping down from stress doesn't usually leave a show intact. A voice actor's changing body doesn't usually get folded into a character's growth instead of quietly erased. Somewhere along the way, enough people involved in this production decided that the honest version of something was worth more than the convenient version, and they kept making that decision season after season, long after the show had already succeeded enough that nobody would have blamed them for coasting. That's the thing underneath all the trivia, if you're looking for it. Facts like these usually get treated as a kind of party trick, a way to sound impressively informed at a gathering of other fans, something to win an argument with. But sit with enough of them at once, the way we have tonight, and they start to add up to something closer to a portrait, not of the land of ooh, but of the actual, physical, exhausted, generous group of human beings who built it. People who kept a typing sound in a theme song because they liked how it felt. People who cast a father to play a father. People who hid a message to a departing friend inside the ghostly chanting of an 11-minute episode almost nobody would ever think to reverse. People who let a boy's voice crack on camera instead of hiding it. None of that behavior is required to make a good cartoon. All of it is required to make a cartoon feel like it was made by people who actually loved what they were doing and loved almost as much the people they were doing it alongside. The show ended the way most good things end, not with a clean, final closing of a door, but with people scattering outward into their own separate projects, carrying pieces of what they'd built together into work that had nothing to do with ooh at all, and yet somehow always seemed to carry a trace of it anyway. You can hear it if you know where to listen. You can feel the same patience, the same willingness to let a joke curdle slowly into something aching, showing up years later in shows made by people who first learned that particular trick while sitting in a review room, waiting for notes on a storyboard about a boy, his dog, and a penguin who turned out to be something much older and much stranger than anyone watching at home could have guessed. And maybe that's the real, final fact worth carrying out of tonight, even though it isn't numbered the way the rest were. A show can be made of 150 documented, verifiable, fact-checked details, actors and composers, and censorship boards and trademark disputes, and a urinal handle that happened to look like an owl, and still, somehow, end up feeling less like a spreadsheet and more like a room full of people who loved each other and loved the work, sitting together in Burbank for 8 years, occasionally singing a pitch out loud because that felt more honest than reading it off a page. If you made it this far, thank you for staying, truly. It's a strange kind of company, this. Two people who have never met, one talking quietly into the dark, and one lying somewhere listening. But it's real company all the same, and I don't take it lightly that you chose to spend this particular stretch of your night here with me, going through the bones of something we both clearly care about. If any of this landed for you, if some small fact tonight made you feel, even for a second, closer to a show you already loved, it would mean a great deal if you left a like on your way out. And if you're not already subscribed, consider staying a while longer. There's more of this waiting, more layers, more of the land of ooh and the people who built it, more nights like this one whenever you're ready for them. Until then, take care of yourself. Rest well. The typing in the background is still there. If you listen for it, it always will be.